Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into an absolute heavyweight academic tug-of-war over how evolution actually works. We'll be unpacking a fascinating new framework from a paper by Sergio da Silva, recently published in the journal Philosophies. This paper takes a really hard look at the current debates in evolutionary biology and introduces a concept that might entirely change how you view the natural world. It's called the survival of the luckiest. Okay, so let's kick things off with a story straight from the source material. Imagine a classic evolutionary setup. Two male frogs are sitting by a pond, intensely competing for a mate. Now, we've all been taught the basic premise of evolution, right? The organism best adapted to its environment wins the day. But when we actually look closely at the chaotic, messy reality of nature, we really have to ask ourselves, who actually survives out there? Is it the fittest, or is it just the luckiest? Well, let's look at what actually happens in this scenario. Frog A is an absolute genetic specimen. I mean, he sings perfectly, his mating call is incredibly loud and robust, and he is the undeniable favorite for sexual selection. The female frogs are highly attracted to him. But there's a massive, fatal catch. His incredibly loud call also attracts a predator. So, Frog A gets eaten before he can even reproduce. Meanwhile, Frog B, who has this weak, way less attractive call, making him the obvious less fit runner-up, is quiet enough to go totally unnoticed by the predator. So Frog B survives and passes on his genes purely by chance. He wasn't the fittest, he was just incredibly lucky. You know, this frog story isn't just some quirky little anecdote. It perfectly highlights the clash between two massive evolutionary theories dominating biology today. On one side, in the incumbent corner, we have the modern synthesis. This is what you likely learned in school. Evolution driven gradually by natural selection acting on completely random DNA mutations. In the challenger corner, we have the extended synthesis. This newer theory argues that random genetic mutations just aren't enough to explain complex traits. It claims that an organism's developmental processes, epigenetic inheritance, and the way it actively modifies its own environment structurally bias and direct the entire course of evolution. And this debate brilliantly illustrates the need for a third perspective, which researcher Sergio da Silva introduces as the survival of the luckiest framework. He proposes this as a really powerful mediating perspective. It preserves the absolute core principles of the modern synthesis, but it argues that the extended synthesis misses something vital: the massive, undeniable role of contingent, overlapping luck. This framework suggests that when different selective forces overlap and actually conflict with each other, it's unpredictable luck, rather than deterministic developmental pathways or pure genetic fitness, that ultimately determines evolutionary success. So what's the actual root of this evolutionary luck? Well, it really comes down to a clash of forces, pitting natural selection directly against sexual selection. Think of natural selection as a negative feedback loop to keep you alive against external threats like predators or starvation. It stabilizes populations. But sexual selection, that operates totally differently. It's a positive feedback loop. It's this wildly escalating arms race within a single species where individuals are just trying to secure a mate. I mean, think of a peacock growing an absurdly large, heavy tail just to look attractive. When these two opposing dynamics clash, like our frog needing to hide to survive, but needing to scream to mate, the outcome isn't some perfectly adapted, optimal machine. The outcome is highly, highly probabilistic. Let's see how this actually plays out in the wild, starting with what I like to call the dung beetle casino. Proponents of the extended synthesis point to the dung beetle as a prime example of a concept called niche construction. The beetle meticulously builds these nutrient-rich dung balls, sometimes even adding specific microbes to create a perfect little nursery for its larvae. The extended synthesis claims this proves the beetle is intentionally shaping its own evolution, actively and deterministically directing its offspring's developmental environment. But the luckiest framework offers a completely different, much more stochastic explanation. Instead of some predetermined master plan, this dung-rolling behavior likely began as a completely random chance variation that just happened to give some ancestors a marginal survival edge. Because of that edge, their offspring survived a little bit better in fluctuating environments. But here's the real kicker: this trait was accidentally amplified when females started choosing mates who happened to be better at making these brood balls. Natural selection kept the offspring alive, but sexual selection hit the gas pedal. The beetle didn't plan its evolutionary trajectory, it just hit the evolutionary jackpot. So the absolutely crucial point here is that complex traits emerge stochastically. And this perfectly explains the downright weird adaptations of the blind Mexican cave fish. This fascinating fish lives in pitch-black caves, has completely lost its eyes, and stores extra body fat. Now, the extended synthesis argues this is clear evidence of developmental bias, that the environmental stress of extreme darkness activated specific, predictable developmental pathways, like turning off the PAX6 gene. They use this to essentially argue that evolution follows wherever development leads. Actually, scratch that, because De Silva's analysis argues this is a lucky statistical dynamic, not some inherent developmental destiny. Look at how this actually unfolds. Following a massive environmental shift into complete darkness, losing eyes isn't some pre-programmed adaptation. It's literally just a random variation that happens to save massive amounts of metabolic energy in an incredibly resource-poor environment. Then, with vision rendered completely useless, sexual selection dynamics randomly pivot to favor non-visual sensory traits, like better vibration detection for mating. It's an accidental alignment of environmental filtering and mate choice. The fish didn't actively guide its evolution. It survived a brutal filter through sheer luck. We see this casino effect again in domestication. Take the incredibly famous Russian farm fox experiment. Scientists bred silver foxes strictly for one very specific behavior: tameness. But suddenly, as the generations passed, the tamed foxes started developing smaller brains, curly tails, flat muzzles, and white patches of fur. The extended synthesis blames this on mild neurocrystopathy, which is a developmental deficit in neural crust cells that physically links all these traits together in the embryo. But from the luckiest perspective, humans acting as selective breeders basically just yanked the slot machine lever. By aggressively selecting for docility, they accidentally dragged along linked, completely random genetic traits. We didn't design a curly tail, it was just a contingent byproduct of the evolutionary dice roll. Now you might be wondering, if evolution is really just a chaotic casino, how are there enough dice rolls to create such incredible complexity in the world? Well, the paper points out that environmental epigenetics generates heritable variation at a truly staggering rate, roughly 100,000 times higher than standard DNA mutations. Epigenetics are these chemical modifications to gene expression, which are often triggered by stress. And because these marks are often reversible and conditional, they don't burden the population with a permanent mutational load. Instead, they act as this massive dynamic reservoir of traits. It's constantly throwing a staggering amount of diverse options at the wall, just waiting to see what gets lucky when the environment changes. When we step back and put all this together, Da Silva's framework elegantly absorbs all these rich biological phenomena we've talked about. It doesn't outright deny the proximate mechanisms that other theories highlight, things like pleiotropy or developmental bias, but it roots everything firmly back into the chaotic, probabilistic intersection of natural and sexual selection. What you should really take away from this is how the luckiest framework strips away the idea of teleology. It completely removes the idea that organisms are intentionally steering their own design and reframes these mechanisms as just more ways to roll the evolutionary dice. As science writer Philip Ball notes in the source material, and as this quote brilliantly captures, life thrives on noise, diversity, chance events, and fluctuations. Evolution simply isn't a highly regulated factory building perfect, optimal machines from a strict genetic instruction manual. It is a highly dynamic, self-organizing process that actively embraces and utilizes randomness. Genes aren't master architects. They are simply tools caught in the noisy, unpredictable crossfire of keeping an organism alive on one hand and getting it to reproduce on the other. Which leaves us with a final, rather provocative thought to take away from this explainer today. If the entire biological world, including the incredibly deep history that eventually led to humanity, is driven less by a predetermined master plan and more by incredibly lucky overlapping dice rolls, what does that say about your own place in the universe? Are we the pinnacle of a strictly directed evolutionary journey, or simply the incredibly fortunate survivors of a billion-year casino? Thank you so much for joining me, and keep exploring the fascinating mechanics of our world.